Namaskara, good evening, and welcome to BIC Streams. Bangalore International Center, or BIC for short, is an inclusive and neutral platform for informed conversation, intellectual dialogue, and exchange of ideas, arts, and culture. Today's session is titled A Primer on Our Civilization, Providing Context. This evening, we have with us Pawan K. Verma, author and former Rajya Sabha member, who will be in conversation with interlocutor, author and professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University, Anand R. Ranganathan. The full bios of both the speakers will appear in the chat box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You may post your questions, comments, and observations in the Q&A box, also at the bottom of your Zoom screen, next to the chat box. And with that, I hand it over to Anand for some opening comments.
Thanks very much, Lekha. Good evening, everyone, and especially to Pawan Verma, if I can call him Pawan Ji. I've known him for some time now. Absolutely wonderful, wonderful gentleman. In fact, he's been, if I can say, cocooned in diplomatic veneer that is slowly rubbing off, thankfully, because diplomats can be rather tricky to chat with because they will never say anything controversial. But we're hoping, Pawan, for something very different because I think it's been a while now since you've retired from your diplomatic duties, and you were affiliated with political parties. But now I think you've rightfully so, if I may say so, again, for all the readers and viewers, you're devoting more time to intellectual exercises that will benefit India as a whole, if not just the diplomatic community. But this evening, we are here to discuss Pawan's new book. It's called The Great Hindu Civilization: Achievement, Neglect, Bias, and the Way Forward. First of all, congratulations very much, Pawan, for this wonderful book. I've read it, and I really enjoyed reading it. And I have a few questions which I hope would be answered undiplomatically, as my tweet suggested, that you've been bored by all very polite and nice questions. But by the way, thanks very much as well to BIC for organizing this. So let me jump straight away, Pawan, because I think the way the whole chat has been structured is we're going to talk for about 30-35 minutes, and then we'll throw it open to audience questions, and a lot of audience and a lot of excitement for this. But let me begin by asking you straight up, are you a religious Hindu or a cultural Hindu? I mean, I ask this because, as you know, there are multiple sects in Hinduism, ranging from atheism to even rejection of Vedas. So in a sense, I want to know where do you belong in this pantheon? And if your belonging to one sect was an inspiration for writing this book?
No, Anand, thank you very much for your very kind words. And like you, I want to thank the BIC for this opportunity and this great pleasure and privilege to be talking to you. To come to your question, I don't think I wrote this book because I'm a practicing Hindu. I'm a practicing Hindu in the sense that I'm not an atheist. Am I a great believer? I don't know, because Hinduism does not consciously interrogate you about whether you are or you are not. I think I have a leaning to Shaivism in terms of Shiva as the manifestation of that Nirguna, Brahm. And that sometimes helps me in meditation. But I don't think I wrote the book because I'm a religious Hindu. I wrote this book, Anand, because I genuinely believe that there are great treasures and wisdoms in our civilizational past which need to be brought out into the sunshine. And I am often flummoxed when I find that Hindus themselves, although I believe non-Hindus would also have an interest in some of these treasures, Hindus show a rather perplexing lack of curiosity about their own past. And this sometimes perplexes me because there is so much to know about. This lack of curiosity often borders on indifference. Partly, I think, Anand, because Hinduism is not in the Abrahamic sense a prescriptive religion. It does not have a certain book, only one pope, one temple, one prescribed ritual. So many of us are Hindus, for lack of a better word, in a more perfunctory sense, being Hindus and never consciously pausing to examine or re examine either their religion or the civilization that was partly, certainly, a consequence of its inspiration. So I wrote this book partly as a journey of discovery for myself, and partly because I genuinely believe that these treasures and wisdoms, and it's not as if it's blemishless, but to interrogate this past and bring it up to the present in a manner which certainly established was one thing, that there is a Hindu civilization and that it is Sanatan.
Right. So you mentioned something very interesting. The interesting phrase was the journey of discovery, and this is where when I want to ask this. By the way, all the questions that I want to ask you are not for the audience. It's just my own discovery because I'm really interested to. I've noted down a few questions and they're genuine questions. So this one that crops up was, there was a survey done during 2011 census. And they found out that, in fact, it came listed out by the government of India that Indian infants aged 1 to 3, 155 million of them were categorized as Hindu, Muslim, Christian, and Sikh. Now, you can just read that and, overlook that fact, or you can think about that. And when you wait to think about that, it really hits you. Because what hits you is that did the census lady or the census guy knock on the door and ask that infant aged 1 to 3, are you a Hindu? Are you a Sikh? Are you a Muslim? Or what did the infant say? You can't even, say anything other than Ma Ba Papa. So, but here is a state that is categorizing Indians who are less than 3 years old as belonging to a particular religion. And that kind of saddened me because I wondered immediately how many of those 155 million infants would go on exactly, to use the phrase that you've used, on a journey of discovery to either embrace the religion that has been thrust upon them by their parents, surely, or by the state, either to embrace it or to reject it. So, and to give you my example, which I don't know whether it's going to be the same, in your case as well, but my grandparents were, I'm talking of, 100 years ago, were ultra religious. My parents were not religious, not ultra religious, but they were believers. And I'm an atheist. So I wonder, when you talk about journey of discovery, and when you say that, yes, you can say, Anand, that I'm a believer, I'm a Shaivite. Have you embraced this belief, or has it kind of gleaned away a little bit as the years pass by? Are you on the journey to atheism, or are you moving away from it into belief?
Well, Anand, I must be honest with you. I don't know whether I'm becoming atheist, because there is one part of me which is deeply involved with spiritual matters. But I'm certainly bordering on the agnostic. I feel that it is an extension of my ego to believe that my puny destiny is being managed in some remarkably complex way by some higher force. And if the old adage, if God didn't exist, he would have to be created, he or she. That is the weakness of human beings because of the sheer unpredictability and uncertainty of life. And no one wants to approach death without some certitudes. And life is an inexorable journey from birth towards death. So I often think that people are religious or more religious often out of fear than out of veneration. But that is a personal assessment. But apart from the religion, Anand, what fascinated me were the civilizational aspects which may be not disassociated from religion but would stand on their own legs in terms of very important secular achievements. For
In fact,
instance,
I'm very sorry to interrupt you, Pawan, but my follow-up question was that, in fact, in this chapter, The Audacity of Thought, you in fact explore this, and I must say rather beautifully that, I mean, here you're talking of, Hinduism, but you make clear demarcation between what exactly we are discussing, that, somebody has thrust this label on the child, you are a Hindu. But you say, no, this is all questioning. So I wondered if you can, elaborate a little bit on that, the audacity of
yes,
thinking that.
because we have six systems of philosophy in Hinduism, and technically they can be called atheist because they are not discussing God in the conventional terms that we define divinity. They are trying to explore, understand what could be the ultimate truth behind the bewildering plurality of the cosmos. And therefore, the term God in a conventional term hardly comes in, and therefore, except for the
Correct.
yoga school in part, I say that these can technically be called atheist.
Yeah.
But it's a remarkable journey.
Yeah.
And it's a remarkable journey for the sheer loftiness of thought or the audacity of thought, because here were sages in a forest millennia ago speculating, and not out of fear because they are not looking for some god who can stand next to them. They are speculating about truth. And I don't wish to sound melodramatic, but truth in the sense of what could be that one principle or that one entity that would give some meaning to the apparent and surface diversity of this universe. So I think that that's quite remarkable. And then, uh, in terms of mystical exploration, which is both dialogic and deeply penetrative, I think that the Upanishads make for absolutely wonderful reading. The
Yeah.
Upanishads, for sheer logic and consistency, the Brahma Sutra, and for its panacea for the existential dilemmas of today's world.
Yeah.
Forget the past. I would say the Nishkam Karma of the Bhagavad Gita, which says do what you have to do without an obsession for a reward. All of these, I believe, are the result of genuinely original, innovative application of mind. They're very cerebral. It's an ideation. And so I call it the audacity of thought. Then the entire balance, Anand, between the Nirgun and Sagun concept in Hindu divinity, I find that fascinating. At one level, you have the Nirgun, Akhand, Achintya, Adrishta, just undifferentiated consciousness, Nirvishesh Chinmatram, supremely intelligent, Sarva Pratyaya Darshanan. But it is Purna, it is Nirgun without attributes, and it is all pervasive, omnipresent, omnipotent, etc., without any attributes at all. And that is Brahm. But without negating it and having accepted it as being truly pervasive and all present in the entire cosmos, then the Hindu mind extravagantly uses its imagination to create the Sagun manifestation of that Nirgun Brahm. And foreigners cannot understand it. What is this
Correct.
thousands upon thousands of deities with what may seem on a superficial glance most amazing attributes, four hands, the symbols they hold, and so on and so forth. If we take Kali, for instance, grotesque features, what they don't understand it is that the Hindu mind, assured beyond doubt between the reality of that one pervasive principle called Brahma, pulled out the fetters and then attributing to the manifested deity, the Sagun deity, everything that the imagination could conjure up. And so this whole balance between Nirguna and Sagun uh, is something that fascinates me, and I believe is a very remarkable aspect of Hinduism. But equally, there are so many other constructs which, if you give me an opportunity, I'd like to speak about genuinely as one of the refinements of Hindu civilization.
Please go ahead.
So, if I may, for instance, the whole notion of the four Purusharths, Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha, they are quite remarkable in defining the balanced life, where neither Arth, the pursuit of money, nor Kam, the pursuit of physical desire, are negated, and yet each is supposed to be pursued in balance towards a final outcome, which is moksha, which is not necessarily in some other life, but is available to you in this life, a state of unblemished bliss, unconditional upon anything else, one of supreme fulfillment and contentment, and total awareness, Chidananda Rupa Shivoham Shivoham. That bliss is available to you in this life as the end product of a balanced life. So it's a remarkable concept. And the notions of dharma, for instance, it requires great courage to have a notion of dharma or the moral ethic of life without the Ten Commandments. Hinduism has none.
Yeah.
Hinduism has the courage to say that there is an ethical core and it delineates upon the virtues of that ethical core, but it goes beyond. This requires great courage and celebration. It goes beyond to say that what is ultimately right or ultimately wrong also depends on context. If there is a starving man about to die of hunger, and there is a rich man's orchard from which that starving man steals one apple, is it theft or is it a desire or an act for survival? Is it condonable or is it absolutely wrong because it is theft? Now, Hinduism goes into those details.
Yeah.
Similarly, with this courage of contextualizing an act before passing final judgment, which is why perhaps Yudhishthir, as in mythology, is a little surprised when he finally reaches heaven to find that all his brothers and Draupadi are in hell, and Duryodhan is not. And even Ravana, who in the epic is supposed to personify evil or what is opposed to Sri Ram's uh, uh, benediction and greatness, is a great Shiv Bhakt. And when Duryodhan dies, the Mahabharat's actual line is that the heavens rain down flowers because he was a great Yodha who fought valiantly. And Krishna, for instance, as God, we know that he cheats in the Mahabharata, not once but 6 times. Now, is it wrong or is it right? Is the end goal important or are the means more important? Now, these are questions which Hinduism goes into with great courage.
Yeah.
And similarly, in the case of Earth and in Kam, I mean, it's quite remarkable for a civilization to so openly accept the pursuit of physical desire as also not just a possibility, but one of the purusharths one of the goals of life. But it's interesting what Vatsyayan says in the Kama Sutra when he's asked, why have you written this book? And he says that Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha, these are the four purusharths of life. And if the first three, Dharma, Arth, and Kam, are all followed in proportion and none in exclusion, they should, as part of a balanced life, automatically lead to moksha. So, this almost Confucian notion of a balanced life, apart from the Purusharths, the four ashrams of life, they show such a pragmatic understanding of the way people are born and grow older and age, and they give a title to it. Similarly, for instance, the achievement in the area of art and aesthetics, whether it's sculpture, music, dance, poetry, grammar, theater. I have tried to, books can be written on each aspect, but I've tried to give more than a glimpse to these aspects. And above all, Anand, the theory of rasa. I mean, it is
Yes.
so remarkable that 600 years before the birth of Christ, not Bharat in his Natya Shastra, he is not writing a compendium of the arts. He is writing 6,000 Sanskrit shloks, which are a meditation on what constitutes the artistic or aesthetic experience.
Yes.
Now,
In fact,
it's a
if I
remarkable
may,
degree of
yes,
sophistication.
correct. In fact, you quite scathing towards other civilizations' understanding of what actually going on. Sorry, I'm kind of I've diverged a little because I've thought of a couple of very interesting questions, but
Please,
because you
please.
talked about what you did, and I quote from you from what you've written, other art forms like music and dance came under hostile scrutiny too. Most British observers mistook all forms of classical dance to be a variation either of the Nautch or an extension of the Devadasi system. So here we are talking in almost esoteric philosophical terms about everything, all movement, human movement per se. And here come the British external civilization. Do you think their disgust or disdain towards us as a race has a lot to do with their misunderstanding of Hinduism and our belief system?
It's not only misunderstanding, Anand, because where they could, they were also important in rediscovering for Hindus as a result of the Islamic interlude much of their civilizational past which had been lost or
Yeah.
neglected or ignored. It's not misunderstanding. It was a deliberate colonial critique of the civilization of the natives with a view to make the natives impress upon the native that it is in their interest to be ruled by the civilizing mission of the colonial power. So colonization always attempts to provide a heen bhavana, an inferiority complex to the culture of those ruled in order to justify ideologically its own legitimacy to rule. And that is exactly what the British did. Of course, I must add that essentially, Anand, and this is something on you and I can have a discussion. All cultures are opaque. Somehow there is this whole notion of a globalized world where everything is now more or less a mirror image of that of the other, and we. But no, cultures are opaque. The manner in which you talk, the manner in which you behave, the manner in which you may bend down to touch a feet, the manner in which you respond, the manner in which you react, the manner in which you use a sentence, a phrase, how you eat. Now, these are really the legacy of those who are born into a culture, and it takes great effort to be able to penetrate that veil that divides cultures, although there is a larger unifying global culture. So I what I mean to say is that for the British to understand the nuances of Indian classical music, the intricate, nothing can be more starkly different than a Western classical music performance and an
Yeah.
Indian classical music performance. Here there is a maestro with notations.
Yes.
And here there is a maestro who sits on very often on the floor, on a
Yes.
divan. He has no notations, and yet he will not stray even
Yeah.
remotely outside the discipline of the rag. And he or she improvise as they go along.
Yes.
And one of the
In fact,
most
yeah.
complex and remarkable notation of rhythm that accompanies it. Now, they're two different things. So the British could not really understand that you
Understand.
could
Yeah.
have music which corresponds to the time of the day, to seasons, to moods, and so on and so forth, and that the elaboration of the rag is a slow and meditative process leading from the alap to the drut to the crescendo. These are difficult things to understand. But there was certainly also the colonial critique.
But here, very beautifully you put it. In fact, I hadn't thought of that analogy. I'm going to add that to the question that I had framed previously, Pavanji, which was, I confess that I had all the intention of trapping you before I started reading your book, because this almost a perennial conundrum. What is Hinduism? Is it a way of life or is it a religion? But 4/5 of your book, it is so apparent that you are in love. You are in love with this concept called Hinduism. You think it is beautiful. You think it is civilizational. You think it is philosophical. You think it is all questioning. I have a couple of questions, difficult ones, if I may say, where you bring in politics, and that's the last 1/5 of the book. But we're just discussing the first 4/5 of the book, where you talk about Hinduism. You almost, in very loving terms, in very questioning terms. And here is where I'd like to insert a little bit of science, if I may, because what comes out from your thesis is that there are very interesting parallels between science and the way you describe Hinduism, in sense that mutations are happening all the time. When you question something, you're not sure, you bring out your interpretation. Nothing is set in stone. So you mutate the religion or the way of life, and it goes further and further and further. And similarly, like in music, if you were to perform Beethoven's Ninth Symphony today, it would be exactly as how Beethoven performed it 200 years ago. But if you were to perform a raga today, it would be within the confines, of course, as you put it, but it would be an interpretation because it's word of mouth, nothing is written. So it's mutated. So let's talk about reforms now in religion, because that's one thing that obviously that wasn't defined, as within the boundaries of your book. So you kind of, I won't say stayed away deliberately, but you didn't possibly have time to write more on it. Maybe that a second volume would follow. But don't you agree, with what I've always thought, that in the case of Islam, a way of life is an offshoot of religion. But in the case of Hinduism, it's the other way around. Religion is the offshoot of the way of life. So, and that is the reason why when you have ways of life change through millennia, through centuries, through thousands of years, and reform is possible. It's not possible the other way around. So do you believe that Hinduism is something that is reformable, unlike other Abrahamic religions?
I think it is, because one of the great strengths of Hinduism, if you accept, Anand, that it is both a religion and a civilization. Just as a digression, in my first chapter, which is called Hindu Civilization, Myth or Reality, some people say rather abrasively, I take on those who question this civilization. The arguments from familiar sources are there is no such word as Hindu, which I rebut. Then, if there is no such thing as civilization. And if there is a civilization, why can't we call it Buddhist? And there is no such word as Hinduism in the singular. Wendy Doniger says it's a cross between a hedgehog and a tortoise, and so on and so forth. I mean, I deal with all of that very strongly. People question all the available scientific data on the antiquity of Hindu civilization. I go into all of that. But one of the reasons, once you establish there is a civilization, you have to ask this question: Why did, along with the other ancient civilizations of the world, Hindu civilization not reduce itself to a museum relic?
Yeah.
Why has it not become an antiquary? Why is it still alive? And the reason for that is an answer to your question, that it has the ability to transform and reinvent itself. Let me give you an example. After the Islamic conquest, the Turkic invaders in the 11th century and 10th century, and 600 years of Islamic rule that followed, there was a great deal of plunder, loot, destruction of Hindu artifacts and centers of learning. And I think Hinduism, in its evolution, received a real setback. But it survived because it reinvented itself. And this is through, in my view, the great Bhakti movement, which is one of the most remarkable movements the world has seen, where for almost 600 years, Hinduism, instead of being a top down religion, became a down up religion. It democratized itself, it went to the masses, it began to use congregational mass instrumentalities like kirtan and uh, group pilgrimages, and some of the most remarkable poetry in the actual language which people spoke, not only Sanskrit, but among the great poets, whether it's Namdev, it's Tukaram, whether it's Vidyapati, whether it's Chandidas, whether it's Surdas, whether it's Antal, whether it's Mirabai, whether it's the Alvars, the Nayanars, whether it's Basavanna, it's Alama Prabhu, this remarkable efflorescence of the reinvention of Hinduism. This is something we have to understand, because take the stark example of Indonesia. Indonesia was largely, if not completely, a Hindu and Buddhist country until the Islamic invasion. And within 200 years, it had become largely Muslim, with Buddhism and Hinduism having been reduced to a minority. Now, this did not happen in India because, unlike what happened in Indonesia, here this uh, Hinduism was able to reinvent itself. Now, coming back to your question of reformable, just to answer it and then we can go on. Yes, today one of the great challenges before us is the reform and reinvention of Hinduism in two areas specifically. One is the inequity, oppression, discrimination, and exploitation associated with the caste system. Hinduism and laws alone will not be able to achieve it. Hinduism, in the modern idiom, has to reinvent itself and go beyond the incorrigible hierarchies it has built for itself.
And you are sure it will, and it
And
has, and it will. You're
I'm sure
confident.
I will inject a greater egalitarianism. And the second is on the issue of gender equality. Uh, in both these cases, caste and women, early ancient India or early Hindu civilization, women seem to have a status of near equality. And for at least a millennium, if not more, caste also was not entirely bound to jati. It was a vocation, and DNA evidence today shows it, intermarriage and intercaste interfaces. But at some point around the second century AD, I think caste became petrified, and notions of women being subordinate became an attempt was made to legitimize them. And these are questions which we need to go into today to reinvent Hinduism. So
Yeah.
I believe it's reformable, which is the only reason why it survived and is Sanatan. And I believe those challenges need to be met face on today. That is why I write, the real need is not for Hindutva, but Hindu Satya.
Yes, I'm coming to that. In fact, Pavanji, we have, as usual, this is such a wonderful discussion. It can go on for hours, but we are really, striving for time here. So I'm going to quicken up the pace, if you don't mind, because I
Yes.
really want to delve into the end of the book. But coming back to this question, I would love to agree with you, because uh, it is, as I said, it has a scientific parallel. I mean, species survive because they mutate. You have helpful mutations that allow them to combat any stress that is provided. That is Darwinian evolution. But I'm afraid when it comes to religion, the evidence, apart from India, as you mentioned, the Indian evidence, seems to be disproving both of us. Because, you talked of Indonesia, you talked of, for example, let's take Afghanistan, for example, there is one Hindu left there, a priest. You talk of various regions in India. But other than that, let me quote someone who actually said something that both of us who agree with each other find it very difficult to disprove. And I'm quoting Gurudev here, Rabindranath Tagore, and I quote him verbatim, quote, "There are two religions on earth which have distinct enmity against all other religions. These two are Christianity and Islam. They are not just satisfied with observing their own religion, but are determined to destroy all other religions. That is why the only way to make peace with them is to embrace their religions," unquote. Now, is he right? Has he been proven right? If you were to exclude for a minute the Indian example, that Hinduism still survives in India, and you're saying that because it has reformed, it has mutated, I agree with you. But then for how long? Is added to this question of Rabindranath Tagore, do you agree with him if you look at the world as a whole?
No, Hinduism may not embrace, but Hinduism has a conquering eclecticism, which is why Buddhism within India never flourished as much as Buddhism did abroad, because the Hindus were about to make Gautam Buddha one of the avatars of Vishnu. So Hinduism may embrace to the point where it homogenizes, but you cannot erase your religion in order to counter another religion. I don't believe it. What you can do is to say that there are limitations to your evangelism, and those limitations would need to be enforced both by law and certainly in the spirit of universal harmony. That is.
So, Pavanji, sorry to interrupt. I must apologize, but as I said, I have so many questions, and the audience would like to hear your views on multiple questions. So, I'm sorry for cutting you short. I apologize again. If BIC can give us 20 minutes more, I'd be very grateful. I'll let us hear from them. But meanwhile, when you were talking about limits of evangelism, are you with what Mahatma Gandhi said? And I quote him again. He said, "If I had the authority to make laws in India, the first law I would make would be to ban proselytization." Well, by the way, I'm not. I'm against Mahatma Gandhi, because according to me, if I can preach atheism, then it should be perfectly all right for somebody to preach religion.
You see, you see, Anand, very briefly, since, as you say, we have limitation of time, there are some religions whose part of their work ethic, and I'm speaking of some Abrahamic faiths, is proselytization. The Turkic invaders came here and made the distinction between Darul Harb and Darul Islam. And they were certainly driven by a great deal of religious fanatical zeal. And one of their professed aims is conversion and proselytization. Now, similarly with Christianity, we are aware of the Crusades and the attempt of missionaries during colonial rule and in some cases afterwards to continue with proselytization. I think there are legal provisions which prevent the misuse of the proclivity within religions to proselytize, including forced conversion or conversion by inducement. I believe they need to be strengthened.
Yeah. Because the money is too much, isn't it? I mean, you talk about both these religions, and if you see the vast swathes of, especially South India, converting, you can actually, it's down the line between, force or coercion or inducement has really blurred because of so much money is being poured in. So what is inducement? I mean, do you say that, look, why don't you become a Christian? I will allow your, children to access the hospitals we have built, the schools we have built. Is that coercion? I mean, if a person is so poor and he cannot afford healthcare, why wouldn't he convert? So these are genuine questions which the state must ask or make laws on. And to be honest, I'm not so sure myself.
No, but Anand, I agree with you there that the line between inducement, coercion, and legal appropriateness is increasingly getting blurred. And we need to see how these laws are enforced and certainly strengthened.
So, I mean, in one sense, we would admit that Tagore was right. I mean, if you pour in unlimited amounts of money and you go on this proselytization spree, there is no way Hinduism can survive, because India is, after all.
There I disagree with you, and I say this with great respect, as you know my respect for you. You see, there is a tensile resilience in Hinduism. There is an intrinsic strength. You normally cannot kill a butterfly with a sword. It's difficult. There are better ways of doing it, but certainly mere force or money power cannot obliterate Hinduism. So I am not particularly worried on that score. I am worried about the aberrations you pointed out in terms of proselytization and conversion. But I do not believe this is a threat to the great fortress of Hinduism and Hindu civilization, because equally as a counterweight and pressure is somehow, as I would like to repeat the phrase, the tensile resilience within Hinduism. And yes, there could be people who become susceptible to it, but there are, I think, far larger numbers for whom the sanskar and sanskriti of Hinduism are not easy to abdicate from.
Right. Thanks very much. So now we come to the final three or the final quarter of our this wonderful discussion, and I have these three blazing questions. I dare say that possibly they should be challenging. I hope they are, because you love challenging questions, don't you? The last quarter, or let's say 1/5 of the book, Pawanji, you bring in politics, rightly so, because this whole thing has to serve a contemporary purpose. It has to interest the modern audience. So I have absolutely no discord with that. But when you talk about Hinduism and Hindutva, first I want to ask you, what, according to you, is Hindutva? I mean, I ask this because there are multiple definitions floating around, and the believers of one religion, as well as their leftist chums, they never tire of drawing a false equivalence of Hindutva with currently, for example, Taliban or ISIS, basically saying that there's nothing wrong with Islam or Hinduism, but everything wrong with Taliban and ISIS and Hindutva, despite them knowing that the Taliban are only following Islamic fundamentals. So do you, for instance, believe that, Twa means essence, and so Hindutva is an essence of Hinduism that itself is almost impossible to define as a religion? Or do you agree with Justice Verma? I don't know whether he's a relation of yours or not, who was certainly, of course, not a Sanghi, when he said in 1995, and I mean, I've read that judgment. It's an amazing judgment by him. He pours into the philosophy of Adi Shankaracharya, of down to Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan, C. Rajagopalachari, and he distills it, and he comes to this conclusion that Hindutva actually means Indian culture. So where do you stand on this?
So I think that if Hindutva is interpreted more purely as the essence of Hindu civilization and religion, it's perfectly all right. My real quarrel is the lumpen interpretation of Hindutva in its political avatar. And that is where I question some of the excesses, especially because I believe it is based on not a sufficient knowledge of Hinduism itself. And that worries me, because Hinduism is much too cerebral a religion for its leadership or its animating impulses to come from a largely lumpen quarter, which is unfortunately very often its evangelism is in inverse proportion to its knowledge. It is averse to dialogue and discussion. It is usually orthodox and conservative. It is often upper caste and patriarchal, and it is prone to violence and taking the law into its own hands. And I believe and it has a tendency to project itself as the Thekedar of Hinduism in terms of generally legislating, at least in terms of verbal propositions, what people should do, what they should not, how they should eat, how they should not, how should they drink, how should they not, how should women dress, what is the right behavior, what is ethical conduct, etc., etc. So I believe that there is a need to save Hinduism from this distortion and excess. Whereas Hindutva, as defined by Justice Verma, is, I believe, if it's so long as it's the essence of the philosophy of Hinduism and Hindu civilization. And I must also confess that the word or the term, when it was used by Savarkar, was as much about the essence of Hinduism and of its civilizational construct as it was of exclusion. And I actually, in my book, write that Savarkar
Yes.
wrote it in a particular context at that time.
Yeah.
He was very upset with Mahatma Gandhi's and support of the
Yes.
Khilafat movement. And he was upset with the downplaying of the heinous crimes in the Mopla riots. And he was still in jail and he wrote a polemic. But to try and implement its exclusionary principle in the form of a Hindu Rashtra today, 70 years after the Republic, is, I believe, not only a most impractical idea, but also against the intrinsic interests of Hindus themselves.
Now, here is where, Pavanji, the line blurs. And if I can say it's very challenging. In fact, that's why one of the reasons why I love the book was it actually challenged me. And the reason why I say line blurs is because when you talk about lumpen, it is very clear from your book that you certainly are not, putting all those people like Savarkar. In fact, you're quite charitable to Savarkar. You quote Vikram Sampath. You talk about, as you said, the times Savarkar was living in.
And the reformist tendency.
And the tremendous reforms, yes, almost very Ambedkarite, in that sense, before him, in fact. So this lumpen, if we can agree, is nothing to do with the Hindutva of Savarkar. That was assertive sense. Coupling it with what many people felt at that point of time, especially, Gurdev, when he talked about the other proselytizing, religions. Do you see anything intrinsically wrong in Hinduism being assertive?
No, I believe Hinduism is not a passive religion. And there are chapter and verse I can quote to it where it is assertive. And I do believe that there is nothing wrong in assertion itself. But I believe there is everything wrong in bigotry, hatred, violence, and purposeful exclusion. And to reduce Hinduism to a monochromatic religion. For instance, a religion, Anand, I ask you, which says Ekam Satya Vipraha Bahuda Vadanti. The truth is one, wise people call it by different names. Written 3,000 years ago. It requires great courage to say it. And it is one of our Mahavakyas. A civilization where its sages say, Ano Bhadra Kritavo Yantu Vishvata. Let good thoughts flow to me from all directions. A religion which has the audacity of thought and the courage to say Udara Charitanam Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam. I embrace the entire world and as my family. Now this religion.
Oh, by the way, I love the phrase Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, and I get a lot of abuse for saying that. It seems it's not, people think you're weak if you think the world is your family. I think it's just the opposite. It's the most scientific assessment.
Exactly, as a scientist, you will bear it out. No, but I am really amazed at the courage. At a time when people were divided into small tribes and only their boundaries mattered and their realm of ideas. Here were sages saying, open up. And that is the strength of Hinduism. When you reduce Hinduism to unsustainable binaries, and mistakenly call that assertiveness.
Yeah.
I believe we are doing harm to Hinduism and Hindu civilization.
Pavanji, last but one question, because I think I'm being scolded by the organizers. But
You
the
and I
thing
can
about
keep talking for hours, Anand. It's always a pleasure.
I know, it's wonderful. But this assertiveness that you talk about, in fact, you devote last chapter to this. Even last but one chapter is half of it is this, and I don't mind it. But I have not a serious grouse with it. But here is the question. You see, when you discuss the contemporary politics, quite away from Hinduism, and in fact, you've done it away from Hindutva as well. What I want to ask you is this assertiveness a recent phenomena? Your book suggests this to be the case, but let me throw in two caveats, Pavanji, if you don't mind. That point to the possibility that, we might be suffering a contemporary social media, if I may say so, saturation bias. Number one, you see, the peak of Hindutva movement was in pre-social media times in the 1990s, as you know, during the Babri Masjid demolition. And number two, if you look at the NCRB crime data over the last 50 years, you will be startled to find that the communal riots have actually decreased over the past decade. I mean, it used to be at its peak in the 1981, with more than 1 lakh occurring every year. Now it is down to below 50,000. So where is this so-called increased assertiveness that you talk about? Because that might confuse the reader from going from Hindu civilization, Hinduism, to Hindutva, to this quote-unquote lumpenness that you talk about, that I don't want this to be assertive. My thing is, my caveat to you is that we were assertive maybe as Indians or Hindus 20, 30 years ago, not anymore. Now we are discussing all religions, on social media freely.
You see, I really believe that communal riots on either side of the spectrum are not proof of assertiveness. They are proof of people being used as cannon fodder, which includes Hindus, or of some people being misled into resorting to the violence against fellow human beings. And perhaps you're right that the number of large riots, communal riots, have come down, but I do not believe that in the new assertion of Hindu rights in lumpen hands, hatred has come down. I feel worried about it sometimes. I don't call it assertiveness. It's a very, very misleading phrase for that kind of demonstration. So therefore, I strongly believe that communal riots are when people are used as playthings by puppeteers, and that it does not behove any religion to kill in the name of religion. And wherever it has happened usually to serve some ulterior political interest, or gone out of control in the hands of people who wanted to go out of control. However, that is a point on which you and I can disagree with.
I was about to say that calls for an entirely new chat, hours long, and I would love to have that. But if we stick to this, just one last point, because what intrigued me about this book, and what I found very special in this book, Pavanji, is that I suppose for the first time you merged in Hinduism, Hindutva, and the contemporary quote-unquote assertiveness that you also talk about, that I may have disagreements with you, especially when I realize that the non-Hindus are doing it as much, if not more, as the Hindus are. I don't know for what reason or the other, but I mean, that's a separate debate, as I said. But if we talk of merging them, as you have in this book, very nicely, let's talk of tolerance, for example. You devote a chapter on this. Now, I put to you that the cost for apostasy in Islam is death. We know that.
Yes.
But the cost of apostasy in Hinduism is veneration, Bharat Ratna, applause, devotion, bhakti. I'm talking of Ambedkar,
I can talk of Adi Shankaracharya.
So where is the assertiveness here? Where is the intolerance?
No, that is assertiveness, Anand, with great respect. If Shankaracharya can say, Chidananda Rupa Shivoham Shivoham, here in the contemporary of his almost in the Middle East said, Anul Haq, I am the truth. And he was beheaded. And here is the assertive Adi Shankaracharya, who is supposed to have revived Hinduism, who has the courage to say, Chidananda Rupa Shivoham Shivoham, I am Shiva, I am Shiva. That is the greatness of Hinduism. No one has
No doubt.
been burnt on the stake in Hinduism for being an apostate, if
Yes.
that's the right word, for heresy.
Yeah.
No one. Because that is the conquering eclecticism of Hinduism. So the Charvaks can say that we believe the Vedas are a bunch of lies. And they are Hindus.
Lingayats.
Lingayats. So
But
I
you know,
can
the addition that I mean, you put it very beautifully. What I thought was lacking assertiveness, you've turned it around, and I agree with you beautifully that is assertiveness. But now I put to you, Pavanji, that it is happening in contemporary times as well. I mean, Ambedkar is an incredible example. You know, here was someone who criticized Hinduism rightly so, left, right, and center, because he suffered. But then he said, I'm born a Hindu, but I won't die a Hindu. He left Hinduism. He was an apostate. And look how we venerate him. You know, you go to where he attained, moksha, or he became a Buddhist. The place is full more of Hindus who come here and worship him, come in Nagpur than Buddhists. So, you know, I'm talking in contemporary times. So I ask you this question. If Ambedkar was a Muslim and he had turned an apostate, do you think he would have been venerated, let alone been alive?
I don't know what form of Muslim he would have been. There are Sufi saints who have been adopted. There are Hindu saints of whom there are Muslim followers. So if he was a fanatical Muslim, I think it would have been difficult to have him venerated today, and large sections of Hindus would not accept it. But in Hinduism, half of the people I know have named their children Gautam and Rahul and Siddharth.
Yeah.
And here was Buddhism, a protest movement against Hinduism. Adi Shankaracharya is called the reviver of Hinduism and is also criticized as being a klepto-Buddhist. So what
but Pavanji, that is what I'm saying. Just to add to you, not to interrupt, that it is still happening. The beauty of it is not, we are not talking of Adi Shankaracharya times. We're talking of contemporary times, and maybe that is the beauty that needs to come out more. That Hindus are accepting, apostasy.
As far as Dr. Ambedkar goes, he may have embraced Buddhism. For Hindus, he has remained a Hindu. By that I mean that within the large rubric of Hinduism, Indic, Dr. Ambedkar is a luminous figure whose role and contribution is a matter of veneration today, especially for the marginalized classes. So this is actually the point I'm trying to make in most of my arguments, Anand, is this is what distinguishes Hinduism. I do not want Hinduism to become a clone of those faiths which will be a guarantee for its destruction. Hinduism, unlike those faiths in many cases, has survived precisely because it is not so brittle, which does not mean it is passive.
Yeah, very interesting. I've absolutely loved, and I've hogged most of the time for the questions, Pavanji. I apologize for that, but we will take a few audience questions because there are so many of them. Rema Venu asked, I don't know where Rema is from, but she asked, every other religion introduces children aged 0 to 3 or older to their religion through schooling except Hinduism, which only extends to Gurukuls. So how are children to learn except from Amar Chitra Katha or storybooks that are more fantastic or phantasmagorical, maybe she wants to say, than real?
Absolutely. I agree that there are many aspects of Hinduism which have been rather arbitrarily excluded from our educational curriculum. And I can understand the reasons why this has happened, but I can't condone it. And there are many secular aspects of Hindu civilization which should be taught. Also, the home is a very nurturing environment. You know, Anand, my mother knew much more about Hindu civilization than what
Yes.
me and my wife know. How are we to convey this to our children if we don't make a little more effort? Ultimately, since Hinduism does not have a Sunday or a Friday congregation, it
Yes.
is by a process of osmosis, by a process of gradual absorption, which has to be both partly ritualistic and partly knowledge based, that you can learn about your own religion and culture and civilization. So these are
Plus, I
areas.
think the temple is no longer the center of
Correct.
your existence anymore. So I think that has
Absolutely.
taken away.
That has gone also. So obviously, more effort needs to be put.
By the way, sorry, are you for the government control of temples, or are you against?
Certainly not. Certainly not. And I believe that this is a very genuine grouse of Hindus. And I discuss these grouses quite transparently in my book.
Right. There is Sanindhya Sandhir. I would appreciate if people can tell where they're from, because that would be wonderful to know. She says, thank you, BIC, for this amazing webinar, and to both Anand and Pawan sir for this talk. If possible, I would like to submit a question for Pawan sir. In a constitutional democracy, we are a truly plural constitutional country. So there are intertwined religions in the end. In this case, how does one propagate our multiple cultures without undermining the political beast of secularism? Quite an interesting question.
Well, I don't think the word secularism is very popular these days.
Correct.
But I do believe that Sarv Dharm Sambhav, or respect for all faiths, is not only an ideological principle which is congruent to that very conquering eclecticism of Hinduism, but is also the only practical solution of a country where so people of so many faiths live. So, and that too cheek by jowl. It's not as if one community is in one geographical area and the other is not. I mean, Anand, I often say that if 30% of West Bengal is Muslim, 25% of Kerala is, 14% of Tamil Nadu and 9% of Kerala, or whatever, you are the great statistician, as I know. I mean, the people live cheek by jowl. I mean, just the population of Christians in India is more than the combined population of Hungary and Greece, when the Christians are less than 2% of the entire population. So, in other words, we have to live, coexist with other faiths, and it is entirely compatible with the worldview of Hindu.
In fact, John Dayal, who's I think his Father John Dayal, or he's a priest, he contends this 2% of Indian population. According to him, it's 10%. And the reason why people don't declare it as much is because if they would lose the benefits that are provided to the SC/STs if they convert to Christianity. So now here is Snehil Raj Singh says, sir, do you think for reviving Hinduism, it's necessary to free temples from government? I think Pawanji has already answered that. He believes yes. Isn't that I don't know. I mean, wild would be a very strong term, or I don't know what to say, Pawanji, but how is it secular that you have only temples under government control and not mosques or gurdwaras or churches? I mean, that's fine, isn't it?
Please, if you read my book, Anand, I say that the word secularism has been greatly abused.
Yeah.
Why should you have only the Hindu personal law being amended?
Yeah. Why should you talk about the Hindu Code Bill? You talk, yeah.
Why should Jawaharlal Nehru, although well-intentioned, have objected to President Rajendra Prasad going to inaugurate the Somnath temple? Why was the Shahbano case overruled by an ordinance? Why was much of the so-called left liberal grouping so silent about the horrific expulsion of the Kashmiri Pandit? I mean, these are questions I raise and I take on board. And similarly,
in fact, I had noted, I had forgotten to mention this because on page 332, you talk about Nehru castigating Rajendra Prasad for the Somnath inauguration. So do you think that's a tragedy that befell our country in 1947?
Yeah, I say that it is well intentioned, but because after the great tragedy of partition and the religious riots that accompanied it, perhaps for the number of Muslims who remained in this country volitionally, there was an attempt to see that they don't feel insecure or to go out of their way to reassure them. But soon this very converted into transparent vote bank politics. And that I am against.
Raj M is asking, sir, a lot of young people think and look at Hinduism as backward, vague, and uncool. How to move forward with this?
Please read,
yeah,
please read my book.
Absolutely, you must. But let me rephrase that question, because I think that's a very interesting question for people who are on social media. I mean, you generally find this leftist trope. When they talk of patriarchy, they talk of only Brahminical patriarchy. We saw that controversy erupting. When they talk of inequality, they only talk of inequality in Hinduism. When they talk of the caste system, which is abhorrent, by the way, they talk of only the caste system prevalent in Hinduism. So when you selectively, keep on highlighting, as a section of India does on social media, the ills of Hinduism, aren't you doing Hinduism a disfavor, Pavanji, by not highlighting the ills of other religions?
Either you can highlight the ills of other religions, or you can frankly say that let's not have a partisan critique and let's have a more comparative critique at the same time. And I believe this is very important. Some of the critique is born out of the belief that everything in Hinduism and Hindu civilization is superstition, prejudice, obscurantism, ritual, and basically social inequity. That is a one-sided opinion which I don't support. No civilizations are without blemishes, and Hinduism also has its share. But let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. But I would say that Hindus today, even not of that lobby, need to introspect and look inwards to some of the reforms which in enlightened categories they must implement. Not because of an animus towards Hinduism, but because Hinduism is a religion that has consistently been reinvented and transformed to suit changing needs. And we need to do that today.
Now, this is, I agree with you 2000%. These are my views. But, let me give you a glimpse of the reality, Pavanji. And I'm not saying that you don't know of this reality, because you are also a product now increasingly of this younger generation. We all are. We are on social media. We are in touch with the contemporary times, news, what have you. The reality is that it has become so one-sided that people don't fear mocking Hinduism, Hindu gods. They don't fear that. You see that in Bollywood. You see that among stand-up comics. You see that in cartoonists. But there is an abject fear, rightly so, of losing your head. Your head being detached from your torso if you criticize Islam, for example. We saw what happened to Charlie Hebdo cartoonists. And this is very prevalent in the film industry. In fact, yesterday there was a cartoon in Times of India where the mocking was being done of Taliban, of ISIS, and then of ISKP. And the fourth panel, the cartoonist was so petrified that, I don't know whether you saw that cartoon, he said, this cartoon is religion neutral. So even criticizing Taliban and ISIS, people are scared. So when you have such lopsidedness, how do you address this? Because people are genuinely scared. I mean, I'm scared. And we have laws in India, starting from the Rangila Rasool incident that happened in 1920, that, if you say anything against, if you offend religious sensibilities, you can be put behind bars. Worse, if you say anything about Islam, you can be beheaded like Kamlesh Tiwari. So in this situation, I think that the question was much more deeper than I gave credit to this person. How do you address this, Pavanji? This would always be lopsided, won't it?
No, because let's assume that many religions have elements which are very sensitive, or many religions are intrinsically sensitive to any critique, especially of certain symbols and icons which are very, very basic to their faith. Now, to resort to violence in protest is, I believe, wrong. And I believe there are many people within those faiths who also believe that this fanatical response is an excess which needs correction. But that is for those religions to handle. As far as Hinduism is concerned, Anand, we have not had such a thin skin.
Yes,
And then
absolutely.
we have not had such a thin skin precisely as our strength. But the answer to that is not to make Hinduism as sensitive as the other religions. The answer is to preserve for Hinduism not the right to mock it without cause, but the right to allow that level of dissent, around the level of critique, of even of questioning, which the Charvaks did to the Vedas.
Yeah.
The point is precisely this, and I really feel that your strength is your ability to be not so thin-skinned. And so we are all Hindus, and we don't have to be constantly looking over our shoulder if we say, but today one great problem is the hypersensitivity of some Hindus, where if in the normal course also, Anand, that in Orissa, Jagannath Puri, in one particular hall, there are devotees who go and abuse Lord Krishna. That is the level of love and intimacy between them, and they say, look, so and so, you had promised to do this for me.
Yes.
What happened to you?
Yeah.
What kind of friend are you? This is the language used. Hinduism allows that.
Yeah.
It is not
if
an
there is,
Islamic faith with
so,
very strong do's and don'ts. So this hypersensitivity which some people show, whether to the expression of physical intimacy, when they don't understand at all the enlightened acceptance of calm, or to suddenly becoming the great preservers and protectors of Hinduism and lecturing to everybody else what they should do and say and not say. That hypersensitivity is also a sign of a misleading assertiveness which misinterprets Hinduism.
no, this is absolutely bang on, and this is the take-home message, which I regret I did not get from the book, but thankfully in this discussion I've got it from you. You've turned around this concept of assertiveness. What I thought was not assertive, you said is being assertive. But Pavanji, you have to also admit that most of this thing, what you say, that look, we have been like this. We have criticized our gods. We revere becoming atheist or lampooning the Vedas and all. But if you keep on doing it just to Hinduism, without acknowledging the fact, even acknowledging the fact, like the films do, like the cartoons do, that we are scared of doing it to other religions, that becomes, that we are going back to the time when you mentioned, for example, Savarkar. He was being assertive because exactly, maybe not in the same philosophical terms, but he saw Gandhi being too much, quote unquote, going on the other side. So hence this defense mechanism, and I think I put to you, it's quite natural, isn't it?
No,
Isn't it natural?
Lampooning, questioning, critiquing, interrogating, criticizing, dissenting from religion requires a great deal of knowledge. If it is done for the sake of it, if it is done to demean, devalue, and denigrate a religion, it's questionable. I would question, you haven't understood the concept. Or at least I would, but I would not go out and behead that person. I would not use violence. I would not beat up a person. I would not take the law in my own hands. I would laugh, perhaps mockingly, at that person for not knowing enough about Hinduism. what Hinduism allows is that touch of venerational irreverence,
Yes.
which I think is a rather nice phrase. Venerational
Absolutely.
irreverence, which
Yes.
only Hinduism allows. In a film song, it says, "Main karu to sala character dheela hai." He's comparing himself with Krishna and saying, "You had the ras.
Yeah.
But if I am seen in that, so my character is dheela." Now, this can happen in Hinduism.
Now, I think this is a very fitting time to end this lovely discussion. Just one question, angry
Yes.
question. Gaurav Kumar is very angry with you, Pavanji.
Okay,
He
ji.
says, "What strength? What strength are you talking about? We lost Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Kashmir Valley. Stories go on. What is the solution?"
No, I think that Gaurav ji, I don't believe you can blame Hinduism for the fact that Bangladesh became an independent nation. Uh, yes, there is an aspect in Hinduism where non-violence or ahimsa is leads occasionally to the acceptance of injustice, which is not the way Gandhiji interpreted it. But I think linking Hinduism, its great strength is that invaders have come and gone and boundaries have been shifted. But Hinduism and Hindu civilization has survived. And that is its great strength, inner strength of this religion.
And do you think it will survive for another 1,000 years, Hinduism?
Not thousand, Anand, for millennia more.
Okay. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you, Pavanji. A real pleasure. And for the audience, once more, I thoroughly enjoyed reading this book by Pavanji, and I highly recommend it as well. Thank you so much to BIC as well for organizing this chat.
It's always a great pleasure talking to you, and
Likewise.
you certainly, because of your intrinsic knowledge and the amount of research and reading you do, make it very difficult for the interviewed. But it's always a pleasure. It's always a pleasure. And thank you, BIC, again.
Thanks very much. Thank you. So your complaint that you weren't being grilled enough, has that been
I have been grilled.
satisfactorily
I hope I
addressed?
have not been found too. I hope I have not been found too wanting.
Not at all. Not at all. Absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. Lekhaji, you'd like to take over?
Thank you for this lively conversation, and hoping that it inspires our audiences who have very kindly joined us in large numbers to go out and read a lot more than they already have. Thank you, Pavanji. Thank you, Anand.
Thank you.
And all I have to say now is good night and see you next time.
Thank you
Thank you
again.
very much. Thank you.
God bless.